Okay, let's take a quick look at some review. So I'm going to go ahead and press play now on this one, and let's take a look. Ooh, got a great square. All right temporal bone. Remember that's here. The pink bone here, anywhere near the ear. Lacrimal bone, again, near the tear duct. Nasal bone at the nose. Left zygoma, it's going to be over here. That one, that bone. The vomer is going to be the lower part of that septum, that bony nasal septum. The top part belongs to the ethmoid bone. It's the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. This bottom part is going to be the vomer. Frontal bone, right parietal is here, makes up kind of the side of the head, anything above the ear. Perpendicular plate of the ethmoid is here. Zygomatic arch goes around this area. Remember, the zygoma makes up part of it, but the majority of the arch is made up of the temporal bone, a little extension on the temporal bone. Sphenoid bone, greater wing, is going to be seen here in the back of the orbit. The lesser wing would have been up there. Zygomatic process of the maxilla is here. Alveolar process of the maxilla is here. Because remember, the mandible also has an alveolar portion or process, and the mandible does near the teeth. Same area, but on the lower teeth. Mastoid process over here. Great. Okay. So let's quickly also just take a look at this one. All right. So let's go ahead and play this one. So right inferior nasal concha is going to be down here. Remember, inferior nasal concha is a facial bone. It makes up that bottom part of the nasal canal, kind of. The other part of the nasal canal or nasal concha are part of the ethmoid bone, and they make up the superior and middle concha. That's talked about in the facial bones video. Okay, area of the vomer is going to be down here. Remember, this is where the nasal septum is. Septum is left maxillary sinus is here. Left petrous ridge, that's going to be this whole area here. It's actually made up of it's part of the temporal bone. So we see the ear is going to be here. The temporal bone is here, and a portion of it runs into the inward, like medially, and that's where we have our organs of hearing. It houses the organs of hearing in there, and you can see it in the orbit. Sphenoid and ethmoid sinuses superimpose here. Mastoid air cells are going to be around here. On this side, they would be over here as well. Left mandibular ramus, right here. Frontal sinus here. You can see it's divided into two, like that usually happens, divided into two. But remember, we talked about sometimes people don't have a frontal sinus at all, or it's not always divided like we see right here. And then crista galli of the ethmoid bone is here. Again, we did talk about I talked about this in the facial bones video. But in this video, now let's move on to the cranium. Biggest takeaways for the cranium are going to be frontal bone and a few areas that are basically around the eyes that we'll talk about in a second. Parietal bone, not too much to that, just it's on the side. Occipital bone, not too much to that one either, except for this little protrusion here, the inion, it's called. And also it has an opening called the foramen magnum for spinal contents. Temporal bone has a little bit more to it, as does the sphenoid and ethmoid. So those three right here are going to be where we spend the majority of the time in this video. For the frontal bone, it's mostly all about positioning. So we need to be able to label the frontal bone, yes. And of course, the glabella we use, but we also may, for positioning purposes, use the supraorbital margin, which is going to be the top part of that orbit here. There's also a superciliary ridge and then the supraorbital groove to kind of pay attention to. Okay, orbital plate. Remember, supraorbital margin is around here. Okay, so frontal bone, not too much going on. There's a sinus in there. Same with the parietal bone, not a whole lot to focus on. I'm going to skip to the occipital bone real fast before we. Where is that? Do I have it? Okay. Oh, it's right here. Okay. The inion is here. And remember that foramen magnum is right here. All right. So first up, one of the more complex bones is the temporal bone. All right, and we have the mastoid portion here where we would see the mastoid air cells in our X-ray, and we did see that here. So this is where we have our organs of hearing, right? That's kind of why it goes inward, right? That's what we're seeing when we labeled it right here, Petrous ridge or Petrous portion. That's where we were seeing it. Also, mastoid portion, where the air cells are, we labeled that over on this side in this picture. So just take note of how kind of you see that bone show up in an X-ray, and make sure to take away the Petrous ridge. Mastoid portion or tip is the tip there, and then that there are air cells in there as well. Also, the EAM or external acoustic meatus or auditory meatus is here. You can kind of see it in this X-ray, and it's just the opening of the ear. All right, next up, the sphenoid. Now, the sphenoid bone is going to be here. Remember, you can kind of see it in the orbit in the back, the greater wings right there, right? But if we're looking kind of down on, a downward view, we see the lesser wing here and the greater wings here. Don't worry as much about the openings. Do worry a little bit more, not only about the greater or lesser wings, but also what we were talking about in class, the sella turcica. So the sella turcica is seen in the lateral view, and it has a posterior clinoid process and an anterior. Then it has the clivus down here, and the sella turcica is just kind of that cup holding the pituitary gland. And we saw an MRI of it here. The X-ray shows it here, and there's our illustration. All right. Our last more complex bone besides temporal and sphenoid is the ethmoid bone. That one is situated in a little notch in the frontal bone. We're looking at it here. Now we're talking about the ethmoid that sits right there and that we can see kind of through the nasal canal right there. And for the ethmoid, the perpendicular plate makes up part of the bony nasal septum. On the sides, it has these masses or labyrinths, and that's kind of why we're going to see a ethmoid sinus. And it's usually a little bubbly looking because of the way the lateral labyrinths are, or masses. Also, it's situated in front of the sphenoid sinus, and that's why in an AP view, we see them superimposed on each other. Okay, let's see here. So those are the biggest takeaways for the sphenoid and ethmoid. Perpendicular plate, lateral labyrinths or masses, and the cribriform plate and Christogalli. We've labeled those on X-rays as well. Christogalli was here. The cribriform plate would be down here, and the perpendicular plate would have been, around here. So for the cranium, those are the big takeaways. Let's see what else. The organs of hearing, it's going to be really straightforward, just labeling. There are 3 ossicles in there, right? The hammer, stapes, anvil, that sort of thing. I remember that from, I think, an anatomy class maybe in high school. And that's just how it is. Hammer, anvil, stirrup. And let's see. So those 3 bones, they're kind of the middle section between the tympanic membrane here and the rest of the external auditory meatus, and then a few more organs of hearing in here, which is, going to be like the cochlea and so on. So major things to remember are those 3 little bones in there and the cochlea. The semicircular canals have a lot to do with balance. They help us balance, or equilibrium, I guess I should say, and direction. All right, so if we're taking a look at our X-rays, Christogalli, this is a little high. I think this is kind of incorrect on this X-ray. Christogalli would be a little bit further down, but still, it's in this general area here. The frontal sinus is there. Sphenoid and ethmoid sinuses superimposed here. Maxillary sinus would be here, harder to see on a PA, a lot of superimposition. When we turn it lateral, it becomes a lot easier to see. Mastoid air cells, that's part of the temporal bone. The mastoid tip is here, mastoid portion. And then we see the petrous ridges in there. Remember, this is inferior nasal concha. The nasal septum here is made up of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid and the vomer. This would be a frontal bone. Parietals would be over here. Temporal zygoma would be around here, harder to see. Sella turcica is there, posterior clinoid process and anterior. All right. And then just a reminder that there are more games on here. For example, if we looked at this lateral x-ray, you can label posterior. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I have to get there. I forgot. Frontal sinus, roofs of orbits, maxillary sinus, mastoid air cells, right here. TMJ is going to be here. It's right there. I know it's harder to see on this x-ray. Ethmoid air cells. Oh, it's going to be around here. Indian and occipital bone here. Sella turcica, along with the anterior and posterior clinoid processes there. Spinous process of C2. That should be, I need to change this. This should be the posterior arch of C1. Okay, sphenoid sinus would be here. Area of the EAM would be here, and so on. Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't get. So let me go in and edit this. This is C1 here beneath the base of the skull, so that should be the posterior arch. All right, I'm trying not to make these videos too long, so I'm going to stop it there.